Welcome to Sinister Heroes. I'm your host, Danny Iniquitous. Thank you for tuning in. If you're new to the channel, this is a channel about Dungeons and Dragons where we try and take a darker tone with everything we do here. So if you like edgy kind of content, definitely hit that like and subscribe button. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters. We love you guys. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you're interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, definitely click the link in the description. And a big shout out to our good friends at Dice Legion. Use the promo code Sinister and get 10% off all of your Dice Legion purchases. That promo code is in the description as well. One more announcement before we get into the video. We are doing a big push to hit 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year. We are halfway there, and we are definitely in a position where we can definitely hit that mark, and we can't do it without you. So if you've been here before, if you like what you see, definitely consider hitting that subscribe button. Without further ado, we're going to jump into this week's video. We're talking about kobolds. Kobolds have been around since the dawn of Dungeons and Dragons. They are tiny little draconic-like creatures. Sometimes they look like lizards. They really are a very funny little entity. They have a penchant for setting traps and being deceptive. You've heard of the 3 kobolds in a trench coat motif and stat block, which I forget which book it was released in, but it exists. Kobolds have a great, interesting concept behind them, but it's something you very rarely see because you normally see them just as kind of like a goblin counterpart, kind of as this like mischievous little entity that causes problems and troubles for everyone around them. But they're not really like that, and their history is so great. First and foremost, I want to address the elephant in the room. They are a small race, and normally I hate them, but I do love kobolds. They are one of my favorite species. I love them a lot. They're cool. Their concepts are very interesting. Them as a people is very, very cool. And they absolutely hate gnomes with a passion, and I am 100% behind that. Kobolds were a very interesting race from Jump Street. When the world was being formed and the deity Io, which is like the deity of all deities, like his domain is divinity, that deity created the divine dragons, and then the divine dragons needed help, and they wanted to create their own sort of species and things to serve them. So Io told them, look, I'm not just going to let you do it. If you're going to create these creatures, you need to sacrifice your immortality to do so. So the divine dragons went ahead and did it anyway, and what they did was they severed their limbs, like their arms, and from their arms grew true dragons, and that's where the lineage of true dragons come from. But the blood that was spilt hit the ground, and out of the ground grew a small draconic species, and that species was the kobolds. Now, the true dragons ended up being like counterparts to the divine dragons and growing alongside them, and they have their own thing going on, which really doesn't interfere too much with what happens with the kobolds. But basically, the kobolds were then sent to mine and dig and find precious metals and golds because the divine dragons wanted those things anyway. That desire for gold and gems goes all the way back to Jump Street. So they started doing that and forming all this great temples and buildings and caves and layers for all these divine dragons. One of them, the kobolds that was just significantly larger in stature, was Kortelmak. And he is the divine being of the kobolds. He was favored because he was larger, and because he was larger, he drew the attention of the divine dragons, and it was particularly a green dragon, and taught him to kind of lead all the other kobolds, because even the divine dragon didn't really care too much about speaking to them directly. So that divine dragon only spoke to Kortelmak, and he figured out everything else for the other kobolds. He built the lair, and then once the divine dragon had all the wealth that it wanted, it released Kortelmak. And then Kortelmak, not knowing anything else, followed suit and built his own lair. And because he was so great to the other kobolds that followed his orders, they all went with him. And they started unearthing great caverns and all this stuff and building Kortelmak's own lair to resemble that of the true dragons. Along doing so, they found these specialized crystals, and inside these crystals were the souls of gnomes. Gnomes come from crystals, and the kobold found them. And in doing so, they released them, and the god of the gnomes gave them like form and whatever, and that's how you got gnomes into the world. And as soon as they were brought into the world, the kobolds enslaved them. It wasn't until the gnome god stole a trinket from a divine dragon that caused him to go to war with Kortelmak that ended up in the gnome causing a cave-in that almost wiped out the entirety of the kobold population. So the gnomes escaped and they got to live on and be the gnomes that they are today. But Io, the divine god of the divine gods, pitied Kortelmak. So he brought Kortelmak into a level of divinity, and now all the kobolds worship Kortelmak. The ones that survive follow his lead and begin their whole world and lifestyle beyond what Kortelmak was. The way that kobolds lived their life after that moment was to emulate Kortelmak. They divined ways through sorcery, which they learned from Kortelmak, those who actually knew him and survived from that encounter, how to find gems and jewels and precious metals in Earth. That's why they're so fantastic at it. So they do this not because the gold or the gems or any of that really matters to them. They do that in almost like a prayer to Kortelmak, because that stuff really doesn't matter to them. They're very weird in that sense. Like they're mischievous and a big plight on the people that aren't kobolds, but they don't really need any of the things that they're harvesting and pulling together. They just dump all this treasure into rooms and they're just like, oh wow, look at this gift to Kortelmak, and then they move on. They're not working. This isn't slavery to them. This isn't menial work. This is high praise to Kortelmak. They can survive off of like leather and bark and whatever's around. They don't need to eat what we need to eat. So their survival is on a very different scope. So they really build themselves particularly around just mining an entire area full of resources and building a temple to Kortelmak and then moving on. They set up traps that are deadly simply because they know they're not strong enough to fight. They are weak in stature. They use slings and daggers because bows and short swords are too heavy for them. They're very oriented into working as a team, and in doing so, their own lives are very precious to them. So that's why they set up all these traps and all these difficulties, because they want to weed you down so that way they don't have to risk themselves to fight the enemy or the intruder or whatever it is. It's a very strange mentality to set up your ways of defending yourself, because it's not about defeating the enemy. It's really built around protecting your people. And that's a concept you don't normally see, especially in a setting like D&D, where you have things like goblinoids, which is like, all right, send all the goblins out, and while they're distracting everyone, drop the bugbears from behind, and then anything that's left over, the hobgoblins will come in and direct as see fit on the battlefield. Like with cannon fodder and the way they set these things up, kobolds aren't like that, because they're all just cannon fodder, and they don't want to risk losing any single one of them. A couple of interesting things about kobold that really set them apart as a people from other species is how they treat each other and their roles. Like if two kobolds are isolated, say they escaped, and it's just those two, they'll try to repopulate when they get into an area where they can be safe and whatever. And if they both end up being the same gender, one of them will swap. And that's a decision that they can make consciously in order to regenerate their race, which is a very wild concept, because it's not something you see that's capable a lot in natural worlds. I think a couple of reptiles can do it, maybe like a handful, but they can do that at will. Another thing is how they treat each other is really unique. First and foremost, because they tend to live in enclosed situations, they're very avertant to interbreeding. So kobolds that look differently from yourselves are more attractive. And it's a very interesting concept because usually a dynamic difference in appearance would be justified as something that would be unattractive or undesirable. But to a kobold, to see that in another kobold, that is beauty to them, which is just like a wild concept. And I think that's really, really unique. Like, I like evil and horrible things and gratuitous violence and scary evil entities and stories like that. And I love to be scared. But that's the pretty thing that I like, you know? Also, if a kobold managed to escape, like, well, adventurers were going through their mine and just obliterating all of them. If that kobold was to find another kobold encampment, those kobold would never question the alignment of that kobold, never wonder what it's doing out there by himself. They would just take them in. They would treat them like family as soon as they came in, as if they were there their entire life, which is a wonderful thing because they're from a separate enclosure, they're now so different physically from them that they're beautiful. And on top of that, that will help them keep their generations going and going and going because of the introduction of a new bloodline. Like, it's so... It was one of the things that caught me so much by surprise because these things steal. These things are you know, they're nasty little creatures. They're problematic. They're mischievous. They're constantly involving themselves in stuff that you shouldn't. Their traps are a horrible annoyance. They always have some important treasure you desperately need, and all the traps will just obliterate you and destroy your party. And they're such a difficulty. But when you take away the opposition to them, they're such a beautiful culture. All they do is mine because that brings them joy. That's how they pray. That's their love. They sing songs to make them work better and support each other because that's how they show love and appreciation. Everything they do is for the entire community. The food that's brought in is for everyone. You're never ugly. You're only beautiful. And you're never alone if you see another kobold. And that It blew my mind when I figured that out about them. And like, it's just an amazing concept that they have. And you never get to see because they're normally just an opposition. But wow, are they amazing. As far as mechanics go, there were 2 printings of the kobolds with both different sets of abilities. Well, it's just a couple abilities that are really different. In the Volo's Guide to Monsters, you had sunlight sensitivity that was taken out of Monsters of the Multiverse, and Monsters of the Multiverse gave you 2 different abilities, which we'll go into in just a minute, and Volo's gave you just the one. Personally, I like the Volo's ability better, but that's something you're going to have to choose for yourself, but most often you'll probably see the Monsters of the Multiverse version of the Kobold. Draconic Cry. As a bonus action, you let out a cry at your enemies within 10 feet of you. Until the start of your next turn, you and your allies have advantage on attack rolls against any of those enemies who can hear you. You can use this trait a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, and you regain all expended uses when you finish a long rest. So this is a kind of reprinting of the other ability in Volo's, which we'll get into in a little bit. It is very, very unique of an ability. The reason why I like the Volo's Guide one, I'll get into in a minute. But this is very cool. You kind of run up, you scream, and then every one of you and your allies have advantage on the enemies within that area, which is cool, which is a great thing. If you do that early enough in a combat and your party members go right after you or before the enemy, that sets up a huge reaction of opportunity for your party. Keep in mind that it does have a 10-foot range, so you can avoid getting into melee with everyone by just standing 5 feet away from them and releasing that. If you're smart enough to position yourself that way, you don't have to worry about disengages or anything like that. You just have to worry about your actual move speed afterwards. And considering this is a bonus action, you could always use dash to get away if you're going to opt not to do any kind of attacks during that time. Kobold Legacy. Kobold's connection to dragons can manifest in unpredictable ways in an individual kobold. Choose one of these following legacy options for your kobold. Craftiness. You have proficiency in one of the following skills: Arcana, Investigation, Medicine, Sleight of Hand, or Survival. Defiance. You have advantage on saving throws to avoid or end the frightened condition on yourself. Draconic Sorcery. You know one cantrip of your choice from the Sorcerer spell list. Intelligence, Wisdom, or Charisma is your spellcasting ability for that cantrip, and you choose when you select this race. This gives you a bunch of different options to use. Depending on what kind of character you are, would kind of depict which one you would need. If you're some sort of caster, then maybe Draconic Sorcerer is better fit for you, so you can get an additional cantrip. Most of the Sorcerer spells list does contain things like Booming Blade, Green Flame Blade, and a lot of offensive spells normally. So if you're needing one, or you desperately want one, that's a good option, especially if you're a bard or something like that. You can definitely pick up some of the more necessary attacking cantrips that you kind of really rely on. Defiance is really great for anyone that's a martial, anyone that has to get close to anybody, a rogue, fighters, rangers, anything like that, because frightened really hurts you, which is one of those things you don't want to have because of disadvantage on attack rolls and the inability to move where you need to move. And that's really what Defiance is for. Craftiness is more adventuring. So if you have a lot of interesting builds and things you've already built for, this will complement your out of combat circumstances, giving you Arcana, Investigation, and Sleight of Hand are going to be your more common skills that you might want to invest in, whereas medicine and survival really are kind of circumstantial and dependent on your kind of campaign. Though I love survival, I don't think it gets the necessary play as it should based on the way the campaigns are structured. Pack Tactics. You have advantage on an attack roll against a creature if at least one of your allies is within 5 feet of the creature and that ally isn't incapacitated. This is from Volo's Guide to Monsters. I love this ability. This is really set to offset their sunlight sensitivity, which the Volo's Guide to Monsters has for the Kobold. Sunlight sensitivity, again, gives you disadvantage on attack rolls and wisdom perception checks that rely on sight when your target of your attack, or whatever you're trying to perceive, is in direct sunlight. Again, direct sunlight is one thing that you don't really encounter a lot, which is why you get that balance of Pack Tactics. Pack Tactics giving you advantage on all of your attacks is profoundly strong, especially if you start going into circumstances where you're building around critting. If you're a paladin, if you're a champion fighter, if you're a barbarian, this would help you a lot. This would be very, very strong for you and something you would really need to consider using or gaining however you see fit. And that takes one of those more problematic circumstances off the table. Now you just always have it. You don't have to worry about making things prone. You don't have to worry about getting people covered in fairy fire. All you need to do is make sure there's an ally there. This helps out for rogues, rangers, everything across the board. Even casters, because all you have to do is attack a creature with one of your allies there. So you can shoot Scorching Ray or Eldritch Blast or whatever it is, and well, as long as what you're attacking is next to your beefy friend, you have advantage. So that's definitely something to consider. It's very powerful. I absolutely love it. I think it offsets sunlight sensitivity really well. Grovel, Cower, and Beg. As an action on your turn, you can cower pathetically to distract nearby foes. Until the end of your turn, your allies gain advantage on attack rolls against enemies within 10 feet of you that can see you. Once you use this trait, you can't use it again until you finish a short or long rest. Now, obviously, Draconic Call does change the way this works. It turns this into a bonus action, which gives you the availability to do a plethora of things afterwards. The reason why I like Grovel, Cower, and Beg is because of what you can do with it. Once Draconic Call happens, you're in a fight. Some little 3-foot thing runs up to you and screams so loudly that it disorients you, you're in a combat. A kobold runs up to you and just starts groveling on the floor, begging for its life. You're not in combat. You know, you're really at a situation where you haven't done anything yet, but you've set up all of your friends to do something great. This is how you set up an ambush. You run up, you have the kobold just get up to the enemy and just drop to its knees and start begging for its life. And while it's doing that, it sets up everyone to take that first action at the same time to obliterate whatever it is you're fighting. As long as whatever you're fighting has some sort of intelligence, is some sort of organized entity, bandits, creatures, monsters, soldiers, as long as they have agency of themselves and not like undead or like beasts, you have a chance to set this up. And all you have to do is just have your party organized enough to know that once you do this ability, everyone sets off their reactions and hits everything in sight. And you can level almost entire encounters right off the bat. You can remove half of the people in that you're going to be fighting just by getting that first round of your whole team getting to go. On top of that, this really speaks to what a kobold is. Because of their love for each other, one of them going out there to do this just so it can better everyone else's chances of surviving and winning. That's a kobold. That's what they do for each other. Not for anybody else, but for themselves. I can see one of them being brave enough to do this. And I love that understanding of their own purpose and their society, that they're one cog in the wheel, but their wheel is so important. Without further ado, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for sticking through. Definitely consider hitting that like and subscribe button. Again, we're doing that huge push to hit 2,000 subscribers, and we cannot do it without you. If you're interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, absolutely check out the link in the description. Thank you so much to all of our Patreon supporters. Big thank you to our good friends at Dice Legion. Use the promo code Sinister. Again, that link is in the description. And thank you for giving a spooky kid a chance.